Hey, welcome back. Let's take another interesting little jog into the world of plants, one of my favorite places. We were discussing flowers, and remember the idea for these couple of days. I'm going to tell you some things that I don't want you to take a lot of notes on this right now. Just listen carefully and listen fast. This is going to be a lightning tour of some of these concepts that we'll talk about later. So, here we go. I think I showed you this earlier. There's obviously a flower, and you'll notice at the bottom of the flower that ovary is going to become a cucumber. And we talked about daylilies here, how you have actually 3 petals and 3 sepals. The sepals and petals look just the same. I think that is a mulberry tree or something like that. No petals. You just have the male and female parts inside. So you recall what we said. You could have imperfect, perfect, complete, incomplete, lots of different ways of looking at flowers and how plants would use them in certain ways. Yeah, this is an unusual tropical plant, and those particular flowers, you'll notice, don't have any petals either or sepals. So it's just the male and female parts coming off of the stem. Same thing here. And let's get a little crazy. Look at this, what used to be a flower, but now has turned into a fruit. And can you kind of see how this plays together? Because that obviously is a tomato. And what you're seeing on the bottom, the petals have fallen off the tomato flower, and the tomato fruit has replaced it. But you actually see the sepals there that are still left over. So as we go along, try to see that these things have counterparts in fruits and flowers, and they don't really disappear. They just kind of turn into some other function on the plant. So once again, some squash flowers. Yeah, and here's a cutaway. You can tell that is a superior ovary because it's above where the petals are attached. Interesting hanging down flowers with no petals. And obviously a whole bunch of stamen or anthers, the male parts, and it looks like in the middle about 5 different parts on a pistil, the female flower. So you'll see in a minute that has some effect on what the fruit will look like eventually. Same things here, inferior. Nope, that's a superior ovary. And your ever popular daffodil or narcissus. Can you see where the ovary is on that? Yeah, even though this one's upside down, the petals are actually above the ovary. So the ovary is an inferior ovary in flowers like this. There's a wild pea plant. And so would you look at those petals and call it symmetric or asymmetric or bilaterally symmetric? And you would be right. That would be an irregular flower because the petals are fused in a weird way that isn't exactly radially symmetric. And there's an orchid flower. Once again, the petals are asymmetric, so that would be an irregular flower. I think that's a fuchsia. A wild pink gentian here in northwest Arkansas. But you get the idea. Different themes of flowers on all of these things. Here's one that looks like lipstick. That's actually called a lipstick plant. And once again, grass. So grass doesn't have a really pretty flower, but a flower nonetheless. And this is unusual. Look at the sepals on this thing. This is called a Chinese lantern, and it actually has a little tomato-like fruit on the inside of it. But the sepals are so big on this one that they actually cover the fruit and the flower and everything else that's inside. This is called Snow on the Mountain, and if you look carefully, what looks to be whitish looking petals with some green centers, those are actually leaves on the plant. And you have to look very carefully to see that the flowers are actually those tiny little things that you see located in the center of it. So some plants actually mimic having petals, and that helps to obviously draw in insects because you don't depend on little tiny flower petals, you depend on colored leaves to do something. Now imagine if that were red instead of white. Yeah, poinsettia. So your Christmas poinsettia plant would be that exact same wild plant that you see here. There's a spiderwort, 3 petals, so obviously that would be a monocot. Flower parts in multiples of 3. A weird plant, I don't know what it is. A bug on a plant. But look at the petals on that. I think I see possibly 10 or maybe 5 sepals and 5 petals, so that would be a dicot. And this is one, angel trumpets. If it's hanging down, it's angel trumpet. If it's pointing up, it's devil's trumpet. So take your pick. But you see 5 petals that are glued together almost like a cap or a balloon or something. So lots of variations in plants. God did a lot of different things in his composition of plants on earth. 5 sepals on the back, very easily visible. Now, you get to flowers like this and you start thinking, where are the petals and how do you have multiples of something when it looks like it's in the hundreds? Here's the trick to this. Is it a flower or is it something else? Yeah, it's called an inflorescence. And so look what the difference is. Here is a simple flower. And I'll just draw it as just a simple yellow flower on the top of a stem. Now look at this. What if you had 3 of those flowers growing on the end of what we call a peduncle? That's a good word for it. So it's got 3 pedicels and the flowers are on the end of that. This is actually a cluster of simple flowers. So when you start having multiple flowers on one particular stem, that's called an inflorescence. And the reason we call it that, you can't call it a flower because that thing that looks like 3 things is really not. It's 3 of one thing, and that makes a big difference. Let me show you some actual pictures of some of these. So here's one way flowers do it, and the size of the yellow dot actually is the age of the flower. So on this particular thing called a raceme, imagine what's happening. It puts up a stem, and the first flower is the largest flower you see on the bottom, and the next day it would put on the second largest, the next day the third, fourth, and fifth. So here we have 7 days of flowers blooming. And you could imagine on this, it would just keep on and keep on and keep on growing, because the one on top that's small now will eventually get bigger. The one on the bottom that's huge will eventually turn into a fruit and still be on there. So that's considered indeterminate growth, because you see it will grow on infinitely until frost comes or until something kills it. There's an example here. So the large flowers on the bottom were the earlier ones, and at the tip of the plant on the right are the younger flowers. Another variation of that. Okay, here's something else. What's the difference in what you see here and what you saw earlier? If you guess there is no little stem connecting the flower to the main stem, you are correct. That's called a spike. So once again, you see God kind of has variations on a theme here. You can have stems attaching you to the stem, or you can be directly connected to the stem. Like this one. This is called a liriope or liriope. This one's called lizard's tail, and you see the same thing. The flowers are kind of flimsy looking, but obviously the older flowers on the bottom, and toward the tip you have the younger flowers. And our native orchid is that way. So you've got the smaller orchid flowers on top, which are the youngest, and it spirals down to the bottom where you have the oldest flowers. Another example there of a spike. So think of all the flower spikes you see, and when you see this whole thing we look at and say, oh, what a pretty flower. Really though, you have to look tiny on it and see that the individual flowers are what the flowers are. The whole flower itself, or what we call a flower, is the inflorescence, or a cluster of flowers. Yeah, here's a pretty one too. What if you had the previous one, a raceme, but you had racemes of racemes? So the bottom raceme still has a largest flower and a next largest and the next largest, but the day after that it puts on another raceme, which also starts putting on flowers, and then the next raceme and the next one and the next one. And that one will go on forever too. But what would that look like in a flower if you had double racemes? It would look like a grass, and that's what that is. It's called a panicle when that happens. And most grasses are double raceme flowers. Here's another interesting one. Do you see the difference in this one? What happened was you still have kind of like a raceme growth, except the older flowers will still be on the outside, but they're on the outside because the inner flower's stem is shorter. And when that happens and it forms a flat flower on the top, that's called a corym. And again, I mentioned that's just a variation on the theme. So these are all sort of raceme growths, but they're just in different forms that give the flowers different shapes. So here's yarrow, one of the popular flat-headed flowers that we have around here. And you can see that's it's a cluster of flowers that have stems that are all the same length, so it makes the flower look like it's coming from, or it's flat on the top. Here's another one, Queen Anne's lace, and that's, you can actually see the stems that are connecting it together. Hydrangea, you probably have that in your yard, but if you pull the individual flowers back, and that's what you see here, about 100 individual flowers that are attached by a corym to make one single thing that looks like a flower, but we call it an inflorescence. Yeah, there's a wild carrot. You may not have known that carrots do that the second year. And you could have this variation. What if all of those come out from exactly the same point on the stem? In that case, that small variation is called an umbel. So just another variation on what racemes can do. Yeah, this is poison hemlock, the stuff Socrates had that killed him. So we still have that growing around northwest Arkansas, so be careful. You don't want to handle that. And here's a dill plant. So if you ever grow dill in your garden, that has the same thing going on. Another variation of the same thing. Lantana, which we see very often, looks like a cluster of flowers. Okay, what would happen then if you send up one single flower and then the next day you send out two smaller flowers below the top flower? And that's what this is. This is called a chyme type of flower. And as opposed to a raceme, this one we call determinate, because what happens? The first flower, it can't get any longer than the first flower. Every other flower will be below the first flower that's put on. So day 3 would look like this. Yeah, you're starting to add more. So we have the biggest flower on top, the oldest one, and we have the second oldest one on the tips of the 2 branches, and the third oldest ones are those 4 there that were just put on. And this could go on for quite a while, but you're limited. You can't just have tiny, tiny flowers most of the time. This one does, but yeah, you kind of see how it works. Smaller and smaller. And look at that. That's how we get strawberries. Strawberries are a type of chyme, and you can tell real easily on this picture. The large strawberry was the first one, the 2 beside it, medium size, and then you have smaller ones, 4 of those, and then 8 of the very small ones. Now, which one would you rather have in your garden, a raceme or a chyme strawberry? It's not a trick question. You may have to have both of them, because if you were a grower and wanted to pick all at the same time, you would probably want a chyme type, because you could wait a couple of days on the big one and it would still be okay until the 8 in a row are ripe, and then you go in with your machines or people and pick everything at once. If you're a home grower, though, you may want a raceme type strawberry, because then you can pick one, and the next day, the next one up will be ripe and you pick it. The next day, it puts on another one and ripens. And you literally could do that for a whole season with a raceme. Tomatoes are that way too. You can either get chyme tomatoes or raceme tomatoes. And if you read the labels when you buy your tomato plants, they will either call it a determinate tomato or an indeterminate. Some interesting variations here. Look at what a scorpioid chyme looks like. It puts out 1 instead of 2 the second day, and then another one below that one, and then another one below that one, and finally another one below that one. And it's not a raceme, you see. That would mean that the youngest flower would be on the top of the stem. So you can see the difference there. I think this is borage, a type of herb plant, but that's a scorpioid chyme. And then finally, what if you had just all the flowers so just matted up together, they just made one big globe on the top? We call that a capitulum. And you see it more often than you think, because look what some typical capitulums look like. Yeah, this is a wild onion or a tame onion flower. If you leave onions in the ground, they come up and make pretty flowers like that. Or this, because do you sort of notice the inside of this black-eyed Susan kind of is a capitulum? With it also has ray petals sticking out, or ray flowers. So it's got two types of flowers, the little black ones in the center, and each yellow thing that we would call a petal is actually a flower. It has its own anther and pistil and everything else that goes with a flower. So no, that's not a flower you're looking at. That is an inflorescence, which makes it a little confusing because most things we think of as flowers are this way, like daisies and sunflowers and things like that. So if you wanted to really get picky with people, you would say, no, that's not a sunflower, that's a sun inflorescence. And they wouldn't care. It would just make them mad. Yeah, more capitulums here. So a lot of things you see are just clusters of little tiny flowers so close together that you can't make out the individual flowers. And even on a zinnia or something like this, you can tell that the central disc there, those are hundreds of little blackish looking flowers surrounded by rows and rows of the yellowish looking flowers around it. Okay, we know it had to come to this, but flowers produce fruit, right? That's the whole purpose, because a plant wants to reproduce, and so it starts by making an attractive flower, or a flower that's windblown or something, for the express purpose of having a sperm cell, or in the case of plants, a pollen grain, come and land on the somewhere on the ovum or the ovary, and it causes a fruit. And actually the fruit technically is the ripened ovary of an angiosperm plant. So anything that has flowers, remember, is an angiosperm. And eventually its ovary, the petals fall off and the ovary is left behind, and we have a fruit. So a fruit is a scientific term. It's not just something you eat for breakfast or something. It's the ripened ovary of an angiosperm. Okay, so let's watch this happen. Here's our flower again. Petals fall off, flower starts to degenerate, and yeah, that's part of life of a flower. It's not supposed to last forever. It's supposed to degenerate once the ovum is fertilized. Its job is almost done now, because now it just needs to grow the baby, or the seed on the inside of the ovary. So here we have the ovary after everything's fallen off of it. And we've seen this earlier when we started looking at how some flower pistils work. But there they are. You've got seeds growing in that thing we called a carpel, and that's surrounded by the ovary, the mother's ovary. That's where, she holds her babies there. And sometimes you'll have an extra layer called a receptacle that I'll show you later. But this is a basic fruit right here. Seeds on the inside, forming a carpel, and then the ovary surrounds that, and sometimes you have a receptacle holding the ovary. Yeah, look at the different ways carpels and ovaries can go together. So when you look at these pictures here, do you see why certain fruits look the way they do? Because they derived from a certain type of flower in a particular form. Yeah, pretty obvious, isn't it? You'll never guess what this is. A banana flower. So yes, a banana is a fruit, and that's what it starts out as. And we've kind of bred bananas so that they don't have seeds, and so it gets away from this that you see right here a little bit, but still, would you have guessed that that would be a banana? That is an okra flower, believe it or not. Okra, we'll see in a minute, is a five-sided capsule, and you see a five-sided symmetry already there. Now that's pretty too. This is a passion flower. We have these in northwest Arkansas. Very pretty flowers. This one is missing its petals so that you can see the many stamen and pistils that are sticking off of it. Yeah, another close-up of what is that? Oh, Alsea tree. Okay, so let's talk about fruits then. This is more exciting than you think, so cheer up, and here goes. 5 basic fruit types that you can get from flowers. And again, just look at this list and you'll see these names later in the year. I'll have some labs where you'll actually identify some of these, but you'll have the names written down for you. So let me show you these 5. Let's look at a basic fruit right here. So A fruit typically has three layers: an exocarp, a mesocarp, and an endocarp. So do you see them there? The lines are pointing toward it, and you can probably guess already that's a tomato. So yes, a tomato is a fruit. The word vegetable in science really isn't a word, so fruit really is something. It's a ripened ovary, so things that we sometimes call vegetables are just, they're something else probably. They're fruit, or in the case of a tomato is actually a berry, and we'll see that in a minute. Okay, look what else we got. All of those together, later on, we will call those a pericarp when you put an exo, meso, and endo. Exo means outer, meso means middle, endo means inner, in case you're wondering. And look at the other things you've got. In a tomato, obviously the seeds are the baby tomato plants for next generation. And you'll notice they're actually attached to a placenta. The middle of the tomato there is the placenta that actually will feed the babies as they grow. So not unlike animals in some respect, you have a placenta and you have the baby tomatoes, the seeds growing there, surrounded by the endo, exo, and mesocarp. Which part of a tomato are you eating to get the tomato-ness, I guess? Yeah, the endo, exo, and endocarp or mesocarp. That's the outer part. That's pretty tasty. And you also eat the placenta and the parts of the placenta that connect it to the pericarp. And the rest of it around the seeds is mostly juicy stuff. So if you're fond of tomatoes, you know what I'm talking about. Here's another type of fruit. We call this a drupe. And look what we've got. You've got kind of a thin, thinnish exocarp. The mesocarp, though, is really pronounced and big and fleshy and mushy and good. The endocarp is very hard and woody. And then inside the endocarp is where the seed is. So can you think of a fruit that kind of matches this description? A thin thing on the outside, a lot of fleshy mesocarp, an endocarp that's not edible. It's just stony, woody stuff, very hard. And the seed is on the inside of it. If you can think of one, you're thinking of a drupe. That's what they call it. And these are things like peach, cherry, apricots, olives, anything that looks like this. So if you've ever eaten a peach, you eventually have this thing called a pit left over. That pit is the stony layer of the endocarp that we're looking at. And if you break the pit open, you may not have ever done this before, but if you take a peach, cherry, apricot, or something like this and break it open, you can break the endocarp stony thing. And what do you have on the inside of it? The seed, which actually in the case of these things is an almond. So in case you didn't know, an almond is the seed of a peach, cherry, apricot tree. Usually they're bred specifically as an almond tree, though, because you don't want the juicy, tasty, peachy stuff. You're interested in the seed inside of the endocarp. And so, yeah, but you could get it in any of the plants that are there. Can you think of another common, maybe Mexican food type of plant or fruit that would be a drupe? How about an avocado? Yeah, look at this one. Here's a peachy, this is actually a pure almond tree, and the peach is kind of diminished so that you could get the inner part, and you break it open, the pit, and you get the almond that you see here, the brown almonds. Also, look at that. What do you think a coconut is? You'd have to see it in its original condition. This actually has 3 coconuts glued together, sort of, but each one of them is sort of a drupe. And here's your endo, exo, and everything, and the milky layer on the inside that surrounds it. But you still see the actual fruit in a coconut there. Okay, another type of fleshy fruit here, a pome. Can you think of something that has kind of a papery outside and a fleshy thing that's not really the mesocarp, it's something else? And then you go further and you find an exocarp that's papery again, and then kind of a really diminished meso and endocarp, and finally several seeds on the inside of it. And what makes this different is the fact that it's the receptacle that you're actually eating. So there it is, apples, pears, They are pomes. And what you see, the receptacle here, is the part that's eaten. And that actually wasn't part of the ovary. Remember, that was a covering around the ovary. The actual ovary is the smaller thing that you can kind of see on the inside of it there that starts with the exocarp. So, and that's not edible most of the time, right? You chew it into an apple, you eat the receptacle, usually you throw away the outer covering of it or the peel, and then you throw away the exo, endo, and pericarp part of it. Okay, my favorite, look at this. Now, remember when you saw a tomato? Look familiar? Yeah, we use a tomato as a typical fruit, but a tomato actually is, ta-da, a berry. Technically a berry. So anytime you see that tomato thing with the exofleshy, the mesofleshy, and the endocarp fleshy with the seeds scattered inside, that is a berry, and that's the way we classify that fruit. So what's that? A tomato flower. And you sort of see how those parts on the ovary, look at on the left over here, those chambers that you see, the pistil chambers, actually will become the chambers inside the berry or the tomato. So it plays out. The flower will look, or the fruit will look definitely something like the flower that produced it in some way. So once again, there's a typical berry. This one is a fancy one with several different sections to it. So tomatoes have been so highly bred that we can do all kinds of things that nature probably wouldn't do. But look at the big placenta on this. This was grown to have huge placentas that would be good for like a sandwich tomato or something like that. But yeah, a typical berry with the seeds in their little chambers doing what seeds are supposed to do. Now compare this one to what you just saw. What's the difference in a pepper and a tomato? Actually, not much at all, except the juiciness. So if you filled these cavities that you're seeing here in the pepper with a liquid, you'd pretty much have the same thing that a tomato was. And that's why these are in the same family. Tomatoes, peppers, all of those are basically the same thing. They produce a berry. In the case of peppers, they produce a more dry berry that doesn't have the juiciness that you would have floating around in between. But you can definitely see the placenta in the middle, and most of the time when you cut a pepper open, you pull the placenta and the seeds off of it, and you only are eating the exo, meso, and endocarp part of it. You don't really need the placenta or the rest of the pepper. You could use it, but most people tend not to do that. Now, here's a variation on that berry. What if you had a berry that had a leathery exocarp? And so see what we're doing? We're taking that same theme of a berry and altering it just a little bit. And now let's keep the mesocarp, but let's shrink it down and make it kind of not very flavorful and just kind of cottony feeling. The exocarp is leathery, and it's the endocarp that's actually the fleshy part that you're eating. And you'll usually spit the seeds out. You can probably tell by looking already what fruit it is, right? Hesperidium, a fancy name for oranges, lemons, basically citrus fruits. So yeah, citrus fruits, we don't typically eat the exocarp. We peel it off, and when we peel it, we typically take the mesocarp with it. That's the white stuff. And then we tend to like that endocarp, that fleshy part that's there. This is a seedless orange. It's been bred to be sterile so that it can't produce babies. And the benefit of that is you don't have seeds because you don't expect to produce another generation. That's a man-made contrivance, by the way. It obviously doesn't work very well in nature to have things do that. Okay, what if you had a berry that had a tough, not really leathery, but just hardish, tough exocarp and a fleshy mesocarp, and the endocarp is sort of fleshy, but it's reduced. And it still looks like a berry, right? So you still have the same berryish kind of formation, but now we're emphasizing the mesocarp as the mostly edible part of it. So think of it as a berry with a thickened exocarp. Yeah, you got it. Squash, cucumber, melons, cantaloupes. These are called peepos. No, I'm not kidding. Peepo, that's what they are. So, yeah, it's a berry, a specialized berry that has a very thick, tough exoscarp. And think about it, if you're the one preparing squash or whatever for your family, you peel off that outer part. On a watermelon, for example, you don't eat the exocarp. You typically are eating the meso and endocarp. And the endo is where you find most of the seeds in a watermelon, which is a very tasty berry. A fancy name here for something that's kind of simple, a caryopsis. Now look at this. All you have on this is a pericarp that you can't even make out the exo, endo, and mesocarp. They are so fused together that they just fuse into kind of a hardish covering around the seed. And the seed is so big that it takes up almost, well, virtually the entire inside of the fruit is the seed. So what does that sort of sound like? Something with a thin pericarp and a very juicy, tasty seed, very large seed in the middle of it. How about a grain? Yeah, most of the cereal and grain crops that we have, corn, wheat, rice, all of those things, barley, grasses, they all produce grains, and that's what they are, a caryopsis. And you can tell what's happening with this picture. The endosperm there, that's the carbohydrate that the baby is going to eat, the embryo baby. And we eat the seed so that we can get that endosperm. And that's the kind of the, it's the seed basically. And typically the embryo is called the germ. So sometimes with wheat, they extract the germ to make white bread. If they leave the germ in it, you get the embryo along with the carbohydrate, and it makes the bread a little browner because you're getting the protein from the actual baby wheat plant or corn plant growing in it. But yeah, caryopsis on a grass. Now, what's different about this? The only difference is the seed isn't connected to the pericarp. So if you pick this thing up and shook it, it would rattle a little bit. You could hear the loose seed kind of bouncing around inside the pericarp. Now, an achene is kind of interesting. A sunflower makes an achene. So if you ever have a sunflower seed, you probably know that you can break open that outer covering if you're into sunflowers, and especially if you buy them with the whole seed around it. But you break it open and you take out the little seed inside. So a sunflower seed, as you know, isn't really the seed. It's the pericarp and the seed. And then you break the pericarp and eat the seed. Yeah, sunflower. Yeah, and dandelions too. You may not know that, but that tiny little seed at the end of a flying parachute dandelion is actually an achene. If you could pick it up and shake it, it would rattle. Now, what if you had almost the same thing as an achene, except let's put a really thick husk around it, kind of a leathery, not really edible, but just a tough, leathery husk around an achene. You've got a nut. Simple as that. So everything that we call a nut may not be a nut. For example, a peanut really isn't a nut. I'll show you in a minute. But other nuts, like most tree nuts that are there, are just that. There's a husk around the outside. So even an acorn, when you think about it, the husk is that little cap that goes on top of it. And then you take the pericarp off if you're fond of breaking acorns open for squirrels to eat, and then the seed is on the inside of it. And some acorns are edible. White oak trees have edible acorns that you actually can't eat the seed. Yeah, here's a pecan nut. So if you're familiar with pecan trees, see at the bottom you have that green husk, and then you pop out the actual pecan. And then if you want to eat the pecan, you have to break the pericarp off of it to expose the seed that's on the inside of it. But yeah, a nut. Now let's make another variation. Let's take that achene that we just had and put a long sail on it that comes off, or part of the pericarp turns into a flattened wing. And again, it's essentially an achene, but in this case, you've probably seen these flying around in the wind. A lot of trees and other plants around northwest Arkansas produce samara fruits, and that's the purpose, that wind can take it or pick it up, and as it falls to the ground, it flutters, which means it stays in the air longer, and it gets a longer distance. And so, yeah, it's better to spread yourself around than to have all your babies come up around your roots somewhere. But there's some achenes here. Ash trees, maple trees. Yeah, just a variation on the theme again. A pericarp inside with a flattened area on the pericarp. A samara. Now the one in the upper left is a lacebark elm. So it has kind of a circular wing around it. Most maples are like the one at the bottom with two together. Now, this one gets interesting. What if you had what looked like a fruit, but it was split open on only one side? And that's important. It doesn't split on two sides, just one side. And it may be confusing when you see some things with two splits, but this one only has one. That's called a follicle. And best example of that is a milkweed. So you can't tell very well from this picture, but there's a milkweed follicle. It looks just like a pod, but it's not. It's a follicle. And when it gets ready to release its seeds, it splits on one side and releases its seeds. Thus, a follicle. Now, there goes some ripe ones flying off with the wind, but you notice it only opens on the one side there and releases those, and really wind-borne. They depend mostly on the wind to carry them. And like we said, the advantage of that is the mother tree wants its babies to flourish and grow into nice, handsome plants, but you definitely don't want your babies staying around your feet for their entire life. So you would be better off, and they would be better off, if they spread far and wide through the wind, which is another good idea our Creator had. You know, the more you can spread a plant around, the better off it is in general for both the mother plants and the baby plants. They don't have to compete with each other as much. Okay, one of my favorites again, a legume. And we've mentioned this before. If something splits on two sides to let the seeds out, you have a legume. So the mature pericarp splits open. You can't really make out the endo, meso, or exo on this one. And this is your typical pod. So a pea, bean, locust tree, mimosa, all legumes do this. So if you see a pod growing on a tree that opens on two sides, you know which family it's in. It's in the legume family, and you know the type of fruit it produces, and they're all related to each other. And also remember, this is where or legumes are those plants that can harbor bacteria that can turn nitrogen in the air into nitrates in the soil. So this entire family has that in common. All the things listed here have the ability to do that. Yeah, recognize these? This is on the left, you have an indigo plant. You find it around Beaver Lake in certain places. And on the right, you have, recognize that? A locust tree, and we have several of those. And yeah, they're legumes, tree legumes, just like beans, alfalfa, and other smaller legumes would be. And again, if you see a pod, that's a tree or a plant that's putting nitrates into the soil instead of taking them out. So we like legumes. Okay, what if you had sort of like a pod, except it splits on several sides? We'll say it this way, 3 or more sides. So if something splits 3 or more different places, you've got a thing called a capsule. So can you think of anything that would split on more than 2 sides? It wouldn't be a pod. It has to be at least one more side than a pod would have. How about okra? Yeah, this particular one, if you look carefully, it splits on 5 different places. And okra is very much like that. It's a 5-sided capsule, along with a thing called a touch-me-not. That's what this picture on the right is. And that is so explosive. It's called touch-me-not because if you touch one of those little roundish things at the top of the picture, it explodes instantly and blows its seeds everywhere. Hence the name, touch-me-not. Another interesting one here. What if you had like a pea pod or a bean, except instead of the seed sticking to one or one of the other sides of the pod, it has kind of a tonguish looking thing that hangs down in the middle of it. And the seeds are actually attached to that tongue rather than the sides of the pod. And it sounds like a small difference, but remember, all of these differentiate family groups. And so if you see that minor detail on something, you can tell, if something has the same fruit as something else, fruit type, it probably is related to that particular thing. And that's the way we classify things in botany, is by looking at fruits and flowers and things that are easy to see. That tongue is called a rhiplum, by the way. Yeah, cabbage family. You probably have never seen this, but if you let your cabbage just stay in the garden all summer and not pick it and not eat it, it will start to grow pods. Excuse me, not a pod, but what is that? A silique. Yeah, it will open up and the seeds of this cabbage plant will all be stuck on the rhiplum that's in the middle of it, the little tongue thing that's there. And again, why do we differentiate between a pod? Well, it's not a pod, and the fact that it's not means that it's in a family of things that do what this one does. So if it has a silique with a tongue in the middle, it's a totally different species or family than a bean or a pea or something. In fact, it's probably in the cabbage family with its own set of characteristics. Now, we can do some interesting things with putting different ones of these together. For example, we can have a thing called a multiple fruit that has many fruits fused together to kind of make a really tight, close inflorescence. And guess what type of flower that would come from? Yeah, probably an inflorescence flower. So again, the flower of something goes a long way in determining the type of fruits that a particular thing will have. We can also have a thing called an aggregate fruit that is a little bit different. It's not just a bunch of fused flowers. It's many carpels fused together within a single flower. Let me show you some examples of those. A bodark thing. This is called Osage orange, horse apple, bodark ball. It has all kinds of different names. It's totally useless though. It's inedible, full of cellulose, so nobody's found a really good use for it. But you can tell by looking at this. Look at all the little individual fruits. In fact, all of those little things you see on the right that have a seed in each one is actually a pome. So this is a cluster of pomes, like an apple. I'm sorry, I meant drupe. It's a cluster of drupes, like a peach would be. So kind of think of it that way. You start out with a flower that it's not just a single flower, it's a cluster of flowers grown together that give you the bodark. In fact, here's what it looks like. The male flower and the female flower. Look at the pistils coming out of that female flower. So the male flower will give off pollen, which one pollen grain will hit the tip of every one of those pistils and eventually form one single drupe that will be stuck together into one huge, worthless horse apple. And if you've ever seen a sweet gum tree, that also is a cluster of drupes. So each of those little spiky things you see was a flower in a cluster. If you could see the sweet gum flower, it would be a capitulum flower that eventually would petals fall off and you turn to a cluster of drupes. And the ever popular strawberry or blackberry. Now wait a minute. If it's called a berry, is it really a berry? So look at that blackberry. And now think of a tomato. A tomato is a berry. But a blackberry, wait a minute, it's not a single berry like a tomato. So what we've got going on, so check out the blackberry there. The blackberry is not really a berry. It's a cluster of berries. So you might think of it like a cluster of grapes, except the grapes are all glued together. And that's what you've got. You've got a flower which had multiple flowers that each one of them would have produced a berry, but they were all stuck together. And so the final form of it will be a cluster of berries, not just a berry. And so you notice the word blackberry there is one word that signifies it's not a true berry. Even though it's made of tiny berries, the blackberry itself is not. Confusing? Yes. Now, what about a strawberry? A strawberry is actually an aggregate of achenes of all things. And so the interesting thing is, those little seeds that get stuck in your teeth are the fruits. They're not really the seeds. And so what you see there, the reddish looking strawberry, is actually the receptacle, like in an apple. And the little tiny yellowish seeds that you're used to seeing are the fruits that are stuck to the fleshy receptacle. Weird, huh? That's considered an aggregate fruit. So the fruit, the strawberry itself, isn't a berry. It's not even a fruit. It's a collection of smaller achene fruits that are stuck to it.